You watch colleagues with less experience get promoted while you work twice as hard and deliver superior results. Every day you pour your energy into tasks that seem important, yet somehow you remain invisible when opportunities arise while others effortlessly position themselves for advancement and recognition. I am Sun Tzu, the ancient strategist whose positioning principles have guided victorious leaders for over 2,500 years. What I discovered about strategic positioning on the battlefields of ancient China will transform how you navigate your workplace, giving you the advantage to win before the competition even realizes the game has begun. The same strategies that won ancient wars can win modern workplace battles. Whether you're fighting for territory or fighting for a promotion, positioning determines the outcome before the first move is made. But first, like this video, subscribe. For more timeless wisdom, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world is ready for strategic mastery. My journey to strategic mastery began in the chaos of ancient China's warring states, where I witnessed the devastating consequences of poor leadership and flawed thinking. I was born into a minor noble family in the state of Wu, during an era when kingdoms rose and fell with the changing seasons, and survival depended not on birthright, but on the sharpness of one's mind. In my early years, I observed generals who believed that courage alone could win battles, that the loudest voice commanded the most respect, and that victory belonged to whoever struck first. I watched these men lead thousands to their deaths while achieving nothing but the satisfaction of their own egos. Their failures taught me more than any victory could have. The turning point came when I witnessed the Battle of Broken Hills, where General Liu commanded 30,000 troops against a force half that size. Liu possessed superior numbers, better equipment, and the high ground, every advantage a commander could desire. Yet he lost spectacularly because he failed to understand the most fundamental principle of conflict. Position matters more than strength. As I watched his forces scatter in defeat, I realized that most leaders approach challenges with their emotions rather than their intellect. They react instead of respond. They focus on what they want to happen rather than what is actually happening. In that moment of revelation, I understood that true power comes from seeing clearly, thinking systematically, and acting with precise timing. I began developing what would become my systematic approach to victory. I studied not just successful generals, but successful merchants, diplomats, and administrators. I learned that the same principles governing warfare also governed every form of human competition and cooperation. Whether you're commanding armies or managing projects, whether you're conquering territories or climbing corporate ladders, the fundamental dynamics remain constant. My reputation grew not because I won the most battles, but because I lost the fewest. I became known as the general who achieved objectives with minimal bloodshed. The first and most crucial law I discovered is this: know yourself completely, without deception or self-flattery. Most people fail not because they lack ability, but because they fundamentally misunderstand their own capabilities, limitations, and true position in any given situation. I learned this lesson through a humbling defeat early in my career. I had been appointed to lead a campaign against bandits terrorizing the northern provinces. Confident in my theoretical knowledge and eager to prove myself, I marched forth with absolute certainty in my superior strategy and intellect. The bandits crushed my forces within hours. As I sat among the wreckage of my first command, I realized I had committed the most basic error of strategic thinking. I had assessed my enemy while completely ignoring my own weaknesses. I knew the terrain, I understood the bandit movements, I had studied their tactics, but I had never honestly evaluated my own inexperience, my troops' lack of training, or my supply limitations. From that moment, I developed what I call the 5 fundamental factors of strategic assessment. First, the way, your core purpose, and the degree to which others believe in it. Second, heaven, the external conditions and timing you cannot control. Third, earth, the terrain and environment in which you must operate. Fourth, command, your actual leadership capabilities and decision-making skills. Fifth, methods, the systems, processes, and resources at your disposal. In the modern workplace, these factors translate directly to your current reality. The way represents your career vision and how well you can articulate it to others. Heaven encompasses market conditions, company culture, and industry trends beyond your influence. Earth represents your specific workplace environment, team dynamics, and organizational structure. Command reflects your actual leadership abilities, emotional intelligence, and decision-making track record. Methods include your skills, network, resources, and systems for getting things done. Most professionals excel at analyzing external factors. They study their industry, understand market trends, and monitor their competition. But they fail catastrophically at honest self-assessment. They overestimate their influence while underestimating their blind spots. They mistake activity for progress and confuse good intentions with actual capabilities. I developed a practice of brutal self-examination that I performed before every major decision. I would ask myself, what am I pretending not to know about? This situation, where am I being driven by ego rather than logic? What assumptions am I making that could prove disastrous? What would my harshest critic say about my plan? This practice of radical honesty became my greatest strategic advantage. While my opponents operated from self-deception and wishful thinking, I built my strategies on unshakable reality. When you know exactly what you can and cannot do, you never overcommit to battles you cannot win, and you never miss opportunities perfectly suited to your strengths. The key is to assess yourself with the same cold objectivity you would use to evaluate a competitor. Your feelings about your capabilities matter less than the actual evidence of your performance. Your aspirations matter less than your demonstrated track record. Your potential matters less than your current reality. True strategic mastery begins the moment you stop lying to yourself about who you are and what you're truly capable of achieving. The second strategic law flows naturally from the first. Know your opposition better than they know themselves. While others focus on their own plans and preparations, I learned to become an expert on every person, force, or obstacle that could impact my objectives. I discovered this principle during my campaign against the warlord Zheng Wei, a brutal commander who had terrorized 3 provinces for over a decade. Every general who faced Zheng focused on their own battle plans, their own troops, their own strategies. They treated him as a simple obstacle to overcome through superior force or clever tactics. I took a different approach. I spent 6 months studying Zheng Wei as if his life were my greatest academic pursuit. I interviewed his former lieutenants, analyzed his previous battles, investigated his childhood, and even learned about his personal relationships. I discovered that beneath his fearsome reputation lay a man driven by deep insecurity about his humble origins and an obsessive need to prove his worth through displays of strength. This knowledge revealed his predictable patterns. Zheng always responded to perceived slights with overwhelming force. He could not resist demonstrating his power when his authority was questioned. He made his most reckless decisions when he felt his reputation was threatened. Armed with this understanding, I crafted a strategy that turned his greatest strength, his aggressive nature, into his fatal weakness. I positioned my forces to appear vulnerable while spreading rumors that questioned his courage and legitimacy. As predicted, Zheng abandoned his defensive advantages to launch an overwhelming assault, walking directly into the trap I had prepared. The battle was over before he realized he had been manipulated by his own psychology. In your professional environment, this same principle provides extraordinary advantages. Your colleagues, competitors, and obstacles are not mysterious forces. They are human beings with predictable patterns, unconscious motivations, and exploitable blind spots. Most people operate from a handful of core drivers: the need for recognition, fear of failure, desire for control, or hunger for advancement. Once you understand what truly motivates someone, their future actions become remarkably predictable. The colleague who needs constant validation will always gravitate toward high-visibility projects. The manager who fears failure will consistently choose safe, conventional approaches. The competitor driven by ego will overextend themselves when challenged. I developed what I call the 5 layers of opposition analysis. First, study their stated objectives and public positions. Second, identify their actual behavior patterns and decision-making tendencies. Third, uncover their core fears and unconscious motivations. Fourth, map their resources, relationships, and support systems. Fifth, determine their blind spots and areas of overconfidence. This analysis reveals not just what they will do, but when and why they will do it. You begin to see the opportunities they will miss, the mistakes they will make, and the pressure points that will cause them to act against their own interests. The key insight is that most people are unconscious of their own patterns. They believe, they make rational decisions based on objective analysis, but they actually respond from emotional triggers and habitual thinking. While they remain blind to their own predictability, you gain the ability to anticipate their moves several steps in advance. This knowledge must be used ethically and strategically. The goal is not to manipulate or harm others, but to position yourself advantageously while avoiding unnecessary conflicts. When you understand how others think and react, you can structure interactions to create mutual benefit rather than zero-sum competition. Remember, information is the ultimate strategic weapon. While others focus on developing their own capabilities, you gain superiority by understanding exactly who and what you're dealing with in every situation. The third strategic law represents the pinnacle of tactical mastery. To subdue the enemy without fighting is the supreme excellence. The greatest victories are achieved not through conflict but through positioning that makes resistance futile. Learn this lesson through my most costly triumph, the siege of Yanshan Fortress. The fortress was considered impregnable, defended by elite troops and commanded by General Feng, a brilliant tactician with an unblemished record. Every military advisor urged a lengthy siege or a massive frontal assault. Instead, I chose direct confrontation. After 3 months of brutal fighting, we captured the fortress. Technically, it was a complete victory. Strategically, it was a disaster. I had lost 30% of my forces, depleted our treasury, and exhausted my troops' morale. Worse, I had won through the most expensive method possible, pure force applied against prepared resistance. That Pyrrhic victory taught me that winning battles and achieving objectives are entirely different pursuits. True strategic mastery lies not in overpowering opposition, but in making opposition irrelevant. My next major campaign demonstrated this principle. Faced with another fortified position, I ignored the fortress entirely. Instead, I captured the 3 smaller cities that supplied it with food, water, and reinforcements. Within 2 weeks, the fortress surrendered without a single arrow being fired. I had achieved the same objective with 0 casualties and minimal resources. This experience revealed the fundamental flaw in how most people approach challenges. They focus on the obstacle itself rather than the system supporting the obstacle. They attack problems directly rather than eliminating the conditions that create those problems. In your professional environment, this principle transforms how you handle every form of resistance or competition. Instead of engaging in direct confrontation with difficult colleagues, you can alter the conditions that make their behavior possible or necessary. Rather than competing head-to-head for the same promotion, you can create opportunities that didn't previously exist. The key is to think systematically rather than tactically. Every problem exists within a larger ecosystem of relationships, dependencies, and supporting structures. Change the ecosystem, and the problem often solves itself. I developed what I call the 3 levels of strategic resolution. Level 1 is direct confrontation, meeting force with force, argument with argument, competition with competition. This level is necessary when immediate action is required, but it consumes maximum resources and creates ongoing resistance. Level 2 is indirect influence, changing the conditions, incentives, or relationships that support the problem. This requires more patience and sophistication, but achieves more sustainable results with less ongoing friction. Level 3 is systemic transformation, reshaping the entire environment so that the original problem becomes impossible or irrelevant. This is the highest form of strategic action, requiring the most insight, but producing the most elegant and permanent solutions. Most professionals operate almost exclusively at level 1. They argue with people who disagree with them, compete directly for limited resources, and meet resistance with increased pressure. This approach occasionally succeeds, but it creates enemies, depletes energy, and generates ongoing conflict. The strategic master operates primarily at levels 2 and 3. They understand that changing minds is less effective than changing circumstances. They know that eliminating competition is more efficient than defeating competitors. They recognize that preventing problems is superior to solving problems. This doesn't mean avoiding all direct action. Sometimes immediate confrontation is necessary and appropriate, but it means always asking whether a more elegant solution exists. Can you achieve your objective by altering the context rather than engaging the content? Can you win by changing the rules rather than playing by existing rules? The supreme excellence is to achieve your objectives so efficiently that observers wonder why there was ever any resistance in the first place. When you master this level of strategic thinking, you stop fighting your way to success and start positioning your way to inevitability. The fourth strategic law governs the most critical decision in any competitive environment: which battles to fight and which to avoid entirely. Most people fail not because they fight poorly, but because they fight the wrong battles at the wrong times for the wrong reasons. I learned this principle through one of my greatest early mistakes. The Duke of Lu had insulted my lord during a diplomatic ceremony, and honor demanded a response. Against my better judgment, I allowed pride to override strategy and launched a campaign to punish this slight. The terrain favored the enemy, the timing was poor, and our strategic position was weak, but I convinced myself that righteous anger would overcome these disadvantages. The campaign dragged on for 8 months, cost us valuable resources, and achieved nothing beyond satisfying wounded pride. While I was distracted by this pointless conflict, our real enemies consolidated power and strengthened their positions. I had won a few tactical engagements while losing strategic ground that took years to recover. This humbling experience taught me to categorize every potential conflict into 3 distinct types: must-win battles, can-win battles, and cannot-win battles. Each category requires completely different strategic approaches. Must-win battles are those where failure threatens your core objectives or fundamental position. These battles must be fought regardless of cost or difficulty, because losing them eliminates your ability to achieve anything else. In your career, this might be defending your reputation against false accusations, protecting your team during organizational restructuring, or standing firm on ethical principles under pressure. Can-win battles are opportunities where victory would advance your position, but defeat wouldn't be catastrophic. These engagements should be fought only when conditions favor success and the potential gains justify the resources required. Examples include competing for discretionary projects, pursuing lateral career moves, or advocating for process improvements. Cannot-win battles are conflicts where victory is impossible or would cost more than any conceivable benefit. These battles must be avoided entirely regardless of provocation or apparent opportunity. This includes arguing with people committed to misunderstanding you, competing for positions that don't align with your strengths, or fighting organizational changes that are inevitable. The key insight is that not all conflicts are created equal, and treating them as if they were is a recipe for strategic exhaustion. I developed a systematic evaluation process that I applied to every potential engagement. First, I assessed the stakes. What exactly would victory achieve? What would defeat cost? How does this battle relate to my larger objectives? Many conflicts that seem important in the moment prove trivial when viewed against broader goals. Second, I evaluated the terrain. Do conditions favor my strengths or expose my weaknesses? Am I fighting on ground I understand or venturing into unfamiliar territory? The same opponent who would destroy you in their domain might be helpless in yours. Third, I considered timing. Is this the right moment for this battle? Would waiting improve my position or allow problems to resolve themselves? Sometimes the best strategy is strategic patience. Fourth, I analyzed resources. Do I have what's needed to win decisively? Will this engagement strengthen or weaken my position for future challenges? Victory that depletes your capacity for more. Important battles is often strategic defeat. Finally, I examined alternatives. Can I achieve the same objective through different means? Is there a way to win without fighting? Sometimes the best battle is the one you don't have to fight. This framework transforms decision-making from emotional reaction to strategic calculation. Instead of responding to every provocation or pursuing every opportunity, you become selective about where to invest your time, energy, and political capital. The strategic master fights fewer battles but wins more wars. They understand that conservation of resources is as important as their deployment, and that saying no to the wrong opportunities creates space for the right ones to emerge. The fifth strategic law concerns the mastery of tempo and timing. Speed is the essence of war, and he who arrives first at the battlefield chooses the terms of engagement. Most people understand the value of acting quickly, but few grasp the sophisticated relationship between speed, timing, and strategic advantage. I discovered this principle during the campaign against the rebel general Zhao Ming, who had seized control of the strategic river crossing at Dragon's Gate. Every military advisor recommended careful preparation, detailed planning, and overwhelming force. They wanted to spend weeks organizing a perfect assault. While they deliberated, Zhao was strengthening his defenses and rallying additional support. I recognized that the window of opportunity was closing rapidly. Zhao's position would become impregnable within days, not weeks. Instead of perfect preparation, I chose immediate action with available resources. We marched through the night, arrived at dawn, and captured the crossing before Zhao's reinforcements could arrive. The battle was over in 2 hours because we controlled the timing. This experience taught me that speed itself is a form of strategy. When you move faster than your opposition's decision-making cycle, you force them to react to your initiatives rather than implementing their own plans. You compress their time for analysis, planning, and coordination, which dramatically increases their likelihood of making critical errors. But speed without timing is mere haste, and haste leads to disaster. True strategic speed means identifying the precise moment when conditions align for maximum impact, then acting with overwhelming velocity. It's not about moving fast constantly, it's about moving faster than anyone else when it matters most. I learned to recognize what I call the 5 rhythms of strategic opportunity. First, the rhythm of preparation, when resources are being gathered and positions are being established. Second, the rhythm of tension, when opposing forces are sizing each other up and testing boundaries. Third, the rhythm of crisis, when circumstances demand immediate action and delay becomes dangerous. Fourth, the rhythm of resolution, when outcomes are being determined and positions are solidifying. Fifth, the rhythm of aftermath, when new equilibriums are being established. Each rhythm requires different strategic approaches and different tempos. During preparation, patience and thoroughness often serve better than speed. During tension, measured responses and careful positioning create advantages. But during crisis, speed becomes absolutely critical. Hesitation becomes fatal and partial. Action often proves worse than bold action. In your professional environment, this same principle governs every opportunity and challenge. Projects have windows of viability that open and close according to market conditions, organizational priorities, and competitive dynamics. Relationships have moments of maximum influence when the right conversation can change everything. Careers. Opportunities have brief periods when conditions align perfectly for advancement. The key is developing sensitivity to these rhythms and the courage to act decisively when the moment arrives. Most professionals recognize good timing in retrospect, but struggle to identify it in real time. They wait for perfect information or ideal conditions, missing the window when good enough information and adequate conditions would have been sufficient. I developed a practice of constant environmental scanning, always monitoring the subtle indicators that signal changing rhythms. When is leadership most receptive to new ideas? When are resources most available for new initiatives? When is the organization most ready for change? When are key decision-makers most accessible and influential? The strategic advantage belongs to those who can sense these shifts before others and position themselves to capitalize on emerging opportunities. This requires maintaining what I call strategic readiness, keeping your capabilities developed, your resources available, and your options open so you can move instantly when conditions align. Remember, in strategic competition, timing often matters more than preparation. The adequate plan, executed at the perfect moment, defeats the perfect plan executed at the wrong time. Speed gives you the power to choose your battles, dictate the terms of engagement, and force opponents to fight on your timeline rather than their own. The sixth strategic law addresses one of the most misunderstood aspects of competition. All warfare is based on deception. When you are able, appear unable. When you are active, appear inactive. When you are near, appear far. When you are far, appear near. This principle creates overwhelming advantages through managing perceptions and controlling information flow. I first grasped this concept during my confrontation with General Wang Shu, a methodical strategist who gathered extensive intelligence before making any move. His strength lay in thorough analysis and careful planning, but this same strength created an exploitable weakness. He based his decisions on the information he could observe and verify. I realized that if I could control what Wang observed, I could control his decisions. I began a campaign of strategic misdirection. I moved troops openly in one direction while secretly repositioning my main force elsewhere. I allowed him to capture false intelligence that suggested weakness where I was strong and strength where I was weak. I fed his analytical nature exactly the kind of detailed, consistent information he craved. Information that was systematically designed to lead him toward the wrong conclusions. When Wang finally struck what he believed was my weakest point, he discovered my strongest defensive position. When he retreated to what he thought was his safest sanctuary, he found my main attack force waiting. The battle was decided before it began because he had been fighting phantoms while I prepared to engage reality. This experience taught me that perception shapes reality in strategic competition. People make decisions based on what they believe to be true, not necessarily what is actually true. When you can influence their beliefs while keeping your true position hidden, you gain the ability to predict and manipulate their actions. But strategic deception is not about lying or manipulation for its own sake. It's about creating tactical advantages through selective revelation and misdirection. There are ethical boundaries that must never be crossed, and the goal should always be achieving legitimate objectives rather than causing unnecessary harm. I developed what I call the 4 levels of strategic misdirection. Level 1 is concealment, hiding your true capabilities, intentions, or position from opponents. This might mean downplaying your qualifications for a role you want, keeping strategic initiatives confidential until launch, or maintaining privacy about your career plans. Level 2 is distraction, drawing attention toward irrelevant information while keeping important details hidden. This could involve emphasizing minor aspects of your background while keeping major strengths private, or focusing discussions on tactical details while concealing strategic thinking. Level 3 is misdirection, actively encouraging false conclusions through carefully presented information. This might mean allowing competitors to believe you're pursuing opportunities you're not actually interested in, or letting difficult colleagues think you're more concerned about issues than you actually are. Level 4 is strategic theater, deliberately creating false impressions that lead opponents to make advantageous decisions for you. This advanced technique requires careful choreography and perfect timing, but it can position competitors to defeat themselves through their own misguided actions. In professional environments, these principles translate into sophisticated positioning strategies. When you're preparing for a major career move, you don't announce your intentions months in advance. You maintain operational security until you're ready to act. When you're developing new capabilities, you don't broadcast your learning journey. You reveal competencies only when demonstration serves your objectives. The key insight is that information asymmetry creates power asymmetry. When others know more about you than you know about them, they hold strategic advantages. When you know more about them than they know about you, the advantage shifts in your favor. This requires developing what I call strategic opacity, the ability to remain professionally engaged and personally authentic while maintaining privacy about your true priorities, capabilities, and intentions. You share information selectively and strategically rather than automatically and completely. Remember, in competitive environments, transparency is often a luxury you cannot afford. The strategic master controls what others know about their position, while working constantly to understand others' true situations. This isn't about deception for malicious purposes. It's about maintaining the informational advantages necessary for strategic success. The seventh strategic law governs the foundation of all collective action. Unity of command and singular focus create unstoppable momentum. Divided leadership leads to divided effort, and divided effort leads to defeat, even when individual capabilities are superior. I witnessed this principle's power through the catastrophic failure of the Coalition of Five Kingdoms, an alliance formed to resist the expansion of the Qin state. On paper, this coalition possessed overwhelming advantages: more troops, more resources, and more territory than any single opponent could match. Yet they were defeated systematically because they could never achieve unified action. Each kingdom pursued its own agenda while paying lip service to collective goals. The king of Zhao wanted to reclaim ancestral territories. The Duke of Wei sought commercial advantages. The rulers of Yan prioritized defensive positioning. When the time came for coordinated action, each commander interpreted orders through the lens of their personal objectives rather than collective strategy. The Qin forces, though smaller, operated with absolute unity of command. Every decision flowed from a single strategic vision. Every action supported a coherent plan. Every resource was allocated according to unified priorities. While the coalition debated, deliberated, and delayed, Qin acted with focused precision. The superior force was defeated by the more unified force. This disaster taught me that alignment creates multiplication while misalignment creates subtraction. When multiple people work toward the same objective with clear understanding and shared commitment, their combined efforts exceed the sum of individual contributions. When people work at cross purposes or with conflicting interpretations, even exceptional individual performance cannot compensate for systemic confusion. I'd learned to distinguish between apparent unity and actual unity. Apparent unity exists when people agree to general principles and shared language. Actual unity exists when people make the same specific decisions in ambiguous situations because they truly understand and embrace the same priorities. In professional environments, this principle determines the success or failure of every team initiative, departmental objective, and organizational transformation. Most workplace failures stem not from lack of individual talent or effort, but from lack of genuine alignment around priorities, methods, and success criteria. I developed what I call the 5 elements of strategic unity. First, shared vision. Everyone must understand not just what they're trying to achieve, but why it matters and how success will be measured. Second, clear authority. Decision-making responsibility must be unambiguous, with final authority resting in a single point rather than being distributed among competing interests. Third, consistent communication. Information must flow clearly and completely throughout the organization, with updates, changes, and decisions reaching everyone who needs to know. Fourth, aligned incentives. Individual rewards must support collective objectives rather than creating competing priorities that undermine team success. Fifth, cultural cohesion. Shared values and operating principles must guide behavior when formal rules and supervision are absent. This is perhaps the most critical element, because most important decisions happen when leaders aren't present to provide direct guidance. The challenge for any leader is creating this unity without crushing creativity or initiative. The goal is not mindless conformity, but intelligent coordination. People should understand the strategic framework clearly enough to make autonomous decisions that support collective objectives. I learned to achieve this through what I call structured autonomy, clear boundaries within which people have complete freedom to operate. Rather than micromanaging individual actions, I focused on ensuring everyone understood the mission, the constraints, and the success criteria. Within those parameters, I encouraged innovation, adaptation, and individual initiative. This approach creates teams that can operate effectively even when communication is limited or circumstances change rapidly. When everyone truly understands the strategic priorities and decision-making principles, they can coordinate automatically without constant supervision or detailed instructions. The strategic master recognizes that building unity requires both inspiration and structure. People must believe in the objectives emotionally while understanding them intellectually. They must feel personally invested in collective success while maintaining clarity about their specific roles and responsibilities. Remember, divided attention produces divided results. The team that can focus all its energy on clearly defined objectives will defeat the team with superior resources but conflicting priorities. Unity of purpose transforms groups of individuals into strategic weapons. The 8th strategic law embraces the paradox of strength through flexibility. Water overcomes rock not through force, but through persistent adaptation to every obstacle. The most powerful strategic approach is to be formless, taking the shape that circumstances require while maintaining your essential nature. I learned this principle through observing General Li Wei, a brilliant tactician who had never lost a battle using traditional formations and conventional strategies. His reputation was built on disciplined execution of proven methods, and his confidence stemmed from mastering every aspect of orthodox warfare. When I was assigned to face him, I knew that meeting his strength with equivalent strength would result in a costly stalemate at best. Instead, I abandoned conventional approaches entirely. Where Lee expected infantry formations, I used mounted archers. Where he anticipated frontal assault, I employed encirclement. When he prepared for siege warfare, I engaged in rapid movement. At every turn, I became what he was not prepared to. Lee's mastery of traditional methods became his weakness because he could not adapt quickly enough to completely unfamiliar challenges. His troops excelled at executing planned maneuvers but struggled when forced to improvise. His officers understood established protocols but became confused when those protocols no longer applied. The campaign demonstrated that rigidity, even when based on superior knowledge and proven methods, becomes a liability when facing adaptive opposition. Lee possessed greater resources, better training, and more experience, but I possessed greater flexibility. In the end, flexibility proved more valuable than any other advantage. This experience taught me that no strategy, however brilliant, survives contact with changing circumstances. The conditions that make a particular approach successful inevitably shift, and the approach that brought you victory in one situation may guarantee defeat in another. I developed what I call the water principle, maintaining core objectives while adapting methods to whatever resistance you encounter. Water never changes its essential nature, but it takes whatever shape the container requires. It flows around obstacles, seeps through cracks, and finds the path of least resistance while never abandoning its destination. In professional environments, this principle becomes crucial for navigating organizational change, market shifts, and evolving competitive landscapes. The executives who thrive over decades are not those who master one approach perfectly, but those who can adapt their methods while maintaining their fundamental principles. The key insight is distinguishing between principles and tactics. Principles represent your core values, strategic objectives, and non-negotiable standards. These should remain constant regardless of circumstances. Tactics represent your specific methods, approaches, and implementation strategies. These should change whenever circumstances require different solutions. Most people make the opposite error. They change their principles while clinging to familiar tactics. They compromise their values to accommodate pressure while insisting on outdated methods that no longer work. This creates the worst possible combination: ethical flexibility with methodological rigidity. The strategic master maintains absolute consistency in principles while embracing complete flexibility in methods. They know exactly what they will not compromise while remaining open to any approach that serves their objectives ethically and effectively. I learned to cultivate what I call strategic fluidity, the ability to shift between different modes of operation as circumstances require. Sometimes leadership demands decisive action, other times collaborative consensus building. Sometimes success requires aggressive pursuit of opportunities. Other times, patient preservation of resources. This requires developing multiple competencies rather than specializing in single approaches. The more tools you have available, the more likely you are to find appropriate solutions for unexpected challenges. The more comfort you develop with uncertainty and change, the less likely you are to be paralyzed when circumstances shift. The practice involves constant environmental scanning and rapid response capability. You monitor conditions continuously, recognize changes early, and adjust your approach before old methods become counterproductive. You treat every setback as information rather than failure, using resistance to understand what different approach might prove more effective. Remember, the strongest tree breaks in the storm while the flexible reed survives. Strategic power comes not from rigid strength, but from intelligent adaptation guided by unchanging principles. The ninth strategic law recognizes that environment shapes outcome more than effort. He who controls the advantageous ground controls the battle. Most people focus on what they bring to a situation while ignoring how the situation itself determines what's possible. The strategic master first secures favorable positioning, then brings their capabilities to bear from the strongest possible position. I discovered this truth during the siege of Mountain's Crown, an ancient fortress built on a peak that commanded the entire valley below. The previous general had attempted to capture it through direct assault, losing thousands of men against the stone walls. When I arrived, I immediately understood that the fortress itself was not the real prize. The valley it controlled was the strategic objective. Rather than attacking the fortress, I captured 3 small watchtowers that controlled the alternate passes through the mountains. Suddenly, the fortress became isolated. Its commanding position over the main valley became irrelevant when I controlled every other route through the region. The garrison surrendered within a month, not because I had defeated them in battle, but because I had made their position strategically worthless. This experience taught me to analyze every competitive situation in terms of terrain, not just physical geography, but the underlying structure that determines what actions are possible and effective. In any environment, certain positions offer natural advantages, while others create inherent disadvantages, regardless of the capabilities of those who occupy them. I learned to identify what I call the 6 types of strategic terrain. Accessible. Terrain offers equal advantages to all parties. Level playing fields where success depends primarily on execution and resources. Entangling terrain is easy to enter, but difficult to exit, positions that limit your options and increase your vulnerability. Temporizing terrain offers no decisive advantage to anyone. Neutral ground where patience often serves better than action. Narrow terrain creates bottlenecks that favor defensive positioning, choke points where smaller forces can hold off larger. One's precipitous terrain offers high risk and high reward, positions that can provide overwhelming advantage but require significant capability to maintain. Distant terrain is far from your natural power base, territory where you operate without your usual support systems and resources. In professional environments, these terrain types correspond to different competitive situations and organizational contexts. Accessible terrain might represent open job markets where everyone competes on equivalent terms. Entangling terrain could be projects that appear attractive but actually limit your mobility and options. Temporizing terrain might be lateral career, moves that neither advance nor harm your position. Narrow terrain could represent specialized roles where your unique capabilities create significant advantages. Precipitous terrain might be high-visibility assignments that offer rapid advancement but carry substantial risks. Distant terrain could be opportunities outside your area of expertise or network strength. The key insight is that the same person can appear brilliant in one type of terrain and incompetent in another. The skills that make you successful as a specialist in narrow terrain may prove counterproductive in the collaborative environment of accessible terrain. The approach that works in the high-stakes environment of precipitous terrain may be overly aggressive for the patient requirements of temporizing terrain. Strategic positioning means understanding which terrain types favor your capabilities and seeking opportunities that allow you to leverage your strengths while minimizing your weaknesses. It also means recognizing when others have superior positioning and adapting your approach accordingly. I developed a systematic method for terrain analysis that I applied to every strategic situation. First, I identified the type of terrain I was operating in and its inherent advantages and disadvantages. Second, I assessed my position relative to competitors and determined whether my current location served my objectives. Third, I analyzed potential moves that could improve my positioning or worsen my opponent's positions. Fourth, I evaluated the costs and risks of different positioning strategies, understanding that superior terrain often requires greater investment to achieve and maintain. Fifth, I considered the timing of positioning moves, recognizing that terrain advantages can shift as circumstances change. The strategic master never accepts disadvantageous positioning as permanent. They constantly seek opportunities to improve their relative position while making it more difficult for others to challenge them. They understand that controlling the high ground, whether literal or metaphorical, provides options that are simply not available from inferior positions. Remember, position determines possibility. From the right strategic terrain, victory becomes inevitable. From the wrong terrain, even superior capabilities cannot guarantee success. Choose your ground carefully and make sure the environment works for you rather than against you. The 10th strategic law establishes the foundation of all competitive advantage. Knowledge of the enemy's situation enables you to calculate the chances of victory, but ignorance of it ensures defeat. Information is the ultimate strategic weapon, and he who possesses superior intelligence controls the outcome before action begins. I built the most sophisticated intelligence network in ancient China through necessity rather than choice. Early in my career, I had suffered several humiliating defeats because I operated from assumptions rather than facts. My enemies seemed to anticipate my moves while I stumbled blindly into their preparations. I realized that without accurate information about intentions, capabilities, and timing, even the best strategies become exercises in wishful thinking. My breakthrough came during my campaign against the Confederation of Northern warlords. Instead of focusing solely on military preparation, I invested heavily in what I called my invisible army, a network of merchants, servants, officials, and travelers who could observe and report on enemy activities. This network provided me with continuous streams of information about troop movements, supply levels, morale conditions, and strategic planning. The intelligence proved decisive when the Confederation planned a surprise attack on our winter quarters. My sources provided detailed information about their timing, approach routes, and tactical objectives 3 weeks before the assault. Instead of being caught unprepared, I was able to prepare a devastating counter-ambush that destroyed their forces and scattered their alliance. This experience taught me that information asymmetry creates power asymmetry. When you know what your opponents are planning while they remain ignorant of your intentions, you gain the ability to dictate the terms of engagement. You can choose when, where, and how to engage. From a position of superior knowledge, I developed what I call the 5 classes of intelligence sources. Local sources are people who operate within your immediate environment and can observe day-to-day activities and conversations. They provide current information about morale, relationships, and tactical developments. Internal sources are people who have access to planning discussions and decision-making processes within opposing organizations. They provide advance notice of strategic intentions and policy changes. External sources operate outside the immediate competitive environment, but maintain relationships with key players. They offer perspectives on reputation, broader market conditions, and industry trends. Converted sources are former allies or employees of competitors who can provide historical context and insight into organizational culture and decision-making. Patterns. Expendable sources are individuals who can be used for specific intelligence-gathering missions where exposure risk is acceptable. In professional environments, these principles translate into sophisticated competitive intelligence and market awareness systems. The executives who consistently make superior strategic decisions are those who possess superior information about market conditions, competitive actions, and organizational dynamics. This doesn't mean engaging in unethical behavior or violating confidentiality agreements. Professional intelligence gathering operates through legitimate channels, industry publications, public statements, social media activities, networking conversations, and careful observation of publicly available information. The key insight is that most valuable intelligence is hidden in plain sight. People reveal their intentions, concerns, and priorities through their actions, choices, and casual conversations. The strategic master develops systems for collecting, analyzing, and acting on this information, while others remain oblivious to signals that are readily available. I learned to distinguish between information and intelligence. Information consists of raw facts and observations. Intelligence consists of analyzed information that reveals patterns, intentions, and strategic implications. Most people collect information but fail to process it into actionable intelligence. The practice requires developing what I call strategic curiosity, a systematic interest in understanding the competitive environment beyond your immediate responsibilities. This means monitoring industry trends, analyzing competitor behaviors, and maintaining awareness of regulatory and market changes that could affect your strategic position. It also requires building and maintaining relationship networks that provide diverse perspectives and early warning signals. The broader and more diverse your information sources, the more likely you are to detect significant changes before they become obvious to everyone else. Remember, in strategic competition, the side with superior information wins. While others operate from assumptions and incomplete data, you gain the power to make decisions based on comprehensive understanding of the competitive landscape. Knowledge truly is power, but only when systematically gathered, carefully analyzed, and strategically applied. The 11th strategic law addresses the ultimate test of strategic capability. True leadership reveals itself only under pressure, when stakes are highest and margin for error is smallest. Anyone can appear competent during peaceful times, but only the strategic master maintains clarity and effectiveness when circumstances become critical. I faced my greatest leadership challenge during the siege of Iron Bridge, when my army found itself trapped between enemy forces and a river in flood. Food supplies were dwindling, morale was collapsing, and my officers were beginning to question my judgment. Some suggested immediate retreat, others advocated desperate frontal assault, and a few even whispered about surrender. The pressure to make a quick decision was overwhelming, and every option seemed to guarantee disaster. In that moment of crisis, I realized that my troops were watching not just for a solution, but for evidence that their leader could maintain composure and clear thinking when everything appeared hopeless. Their confidence in my leadership would determine their willingness to execute whatever plan I chose, and their execution would determine whether any plan could succeed. I forced myself to ignore the emotional pressure and return to systematic analysis. I gathered my most trusted advisors, acknowledged the severity of our situation honestly, and began methodically evaluating our actual options rather than reacting to our apparent limitations. This process revealed a possibility that none of us had initially considered: a night crossing at a narrow point upstream where the enemy wouldn't expect movement. The plan required precise timing, absolute silence, and flawless coordination, but it offered our only realistic chance of escape. More importantly, it gave my troops something concrete to focus on, rather than abstract fears about our situation. We spent the entire day preparing for the crossing with the kind of detailed attention that builds confidence through competence. The operation succeeded because my leadership under pressure had convinced my troops that success was possible, even in desperate circumstances. They executed the plan with precision because they believed in both the strategy and the strategist. Leadership under pressure, I learned, is less about having perfect solutions and more about maintaining the clarity and confidence that enables others to perform at their highest level. This experience taught me the 5 principles of pressure leadership. First, acknowledge reality without surrendering to despair. People need leaders who can face difficult truths honestly, while maintaining belief that solutions exist. Denial destroys credibility, but hopelessness destroys motivation. Second, focus on what you can control rather than lamenting what you cannot. Pressure situations always involve factors beyond your influence, but effective leaders concentrate their energy and attention on the variables they can actually affect. Third, make decisions based on analysis rather than emotion. Pressure creates urgency, and urgency tempts leaders to choose the first available option rather than the best available option. The strategic leader maintains systematic thinking, even when time is short. Fourth, communicate with clarity and conviction. During crisis, people desperately need to understand what's happening, what's expected of them, and why the chosen approach makes sense. Ambiguous or hesitant communication multiplies uncertainty and undermines execution. Fifth, demonstrate confidence through competence rather than bravado. False confidence fools no one and often makes situations worse. Genuine confidence comes from thorough preparation, careful analysis, and realistic assessment of capabilities and options. In professional environments, these principles become essential. During organizational crises, market downturns, competitive threats, and performance challenges, the leaders who advance during difficult times are those who help others navigate uncertainty rather than adding to the confusion. The key insight is that pressure reveals character but doesn't determine it. The qualities you demonstrate under stress must be developed and practiced during calm periods. You cannot become a pressure leader by reading about techniques. You must build the habits of systematic thinking, clear communication, and confident decision-making through consistent practice in low-stakes situations. I developed what I call pressure preparation protocols, systematic approaches to decision-making that function effectively even when time is short and stakes are high. These protocols include rapid situation assessment, quick option generation, stakeholder impact analysis, and implementation planning. By practicing these processes during routine decisions, they become automatic during crisis situations. Remember, pressure creates diamonds and dust. The difference lies not in the external circumstances, but in the internal capacity to maintain strategic thinking when others lose their clarity. Leadership under pressure is the ultimate competitive advantage because it enables superior performance precisely when superior performance matters most. The 12th strategic law governs the foundation of all sustained competitive advantage. He who understands the importance of provisions will win, while he who neglects logistics will lose, regardless of tactical brilliance. Most people focus on dramatic actions and visible strategies while ignoring the mundane systems that determine whether any strategy can actually be implemented successfully. I learned this lesson through watching the spectacular collapse of General Chen Lu, a tactical genius whose innovative battlefield maneuvers had earned him legendary status. Chen could outfight any opponent in direct engagement, but he treated supply management as a boring administrative detail unworthy of strategic attention. His focus remained exclusively on combat operations while leaving logistics to subordinates. During his final campaign, Chen's forces advanced rapidly into enemy territory, winning a series of brilliant tactical victories that seemed to confirm his reputation as an unstoppable military mind. However, his extended supply lines became increasingly vulnerable as he pushed deeper into hostile territory without securing adequate provisions or establishing reliable communication links with his support base. The enemy, recognizing Chen's weakness, avoided direct confrontation and instead focused on disrupting his logistics network. They attacked supply convoys, cut communication lines, and poisoned water sources along his route. Within weeks, Chen's army was starving, isolated, and demoralized. His tactical superiority became irrelevant when his troops lacked the resources necessary to fight effectively. The campaign ended in complete disaster. Chen's forces disintegrated not through battlefield defeat, but through logistical collapse. The general who had never lost a battle lost the war because he failed to understand that strategy must be supported by systematic resource management. This catastrophe taught me that logistics is strategy made manifest. The most brilliant plan becomes worthless if you lack the resources to implement it effectively. The most inspiring vision fails if you cannot sustain the effort required to achieve it. Strategic success depends as much on resource allocation and supply chain management as on tactical innovation and competitive positioning. I developed what I call the 5 pillars of strategic resource management. First, accurate assessment of true costs and requirements. Most strategic failures stem from underestimating the resources needed for successful implementation. This includes not just obvious costs like money and time, but hidden costs like organizational attention, political capital, and opportunity costs of alternative approaches. Second, sustainable supply systems that can maintain consistent resource flow even under adverse conditions. It's not enough to have adequate resources at the beginning of an initiative. You must ensure continuous availability throughout the entire implementation period, including contingencies for unexpected delays or complications. Third, efficient resource utilization that maximizes return on investment while minimizing waste. This requires systematic monitoring of resource consumption, identification of inefficiencies, and continuous optimization of processes and procedures. Fourth, strategic reserves maintained for unexpected opportunities or emergencies. The leader who operates at maximum capacity has no flexibility when circumstances change. Strategic reserves provide the capability to respond quickly to new threats or capitalize on unforeseen advantages. Fifth, alternative resource sources that reduce dependence on single suppliers or support systems. Diversity in resource acquisition creates resilience and reduces vulnerability to supply disruptions or relationship changes. In professional environments, these principles apply to every aspect of career and business strategy. The projects that fail most often are those that begin with inadequate resource planning or unsustainable resource consumption rates. The professionals who plateau are frequently those who invest their time, energy, and attention inefficiently, rather than focusing on activities that generate the highest strategic returns. The key insight is that resource management is not just about having enough. It's about having the right resources in the right quantities at the right times. Timing mismatches can be as fatal as resource shortages. Having abundance of the wrong resources provides no advantage, while having modest amounts of the right resources can create overwhelming competitive positioning. I learned to think in terms of resource portfolios rather than individual resource categories. Financial resources, time resources, relationship resources, knowledge resources, and energy resources all interact with each other in complex ways. Strength in one area can compensate for weakness in another, but only if you understand the trade-offs and manage the portfolio strategically. This requires developing what I call strategic resource consciousness, continuous awareness of your resource position and consumption patterns. Most people operate unconsciously, spending resources without systematic consideration of alternatives or returns on investment. The strategic master treats every resource decision as a strategic choice that either advances or undermines their competitive position. Remember, brilliant strategies without adequate resources become expensive failures, while adequate strategies with superior resource management often achieve extraordinary success. The unsexy work of logistics and supply chain management often determines the outcome more than dramatic tactical innovations. The 13th strategic law addresses the most sophisticated form of competitive advantage. The supreme excellence consists in breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting, and this is achieved by attacking their plans, disrupting their alliances, and undermining their psychological foundation. Physical defeat is temporary, but psychological defeat can be permanent. I discovered this principle during my confrontation with the warlord Liu Khan, whose reputation for savage brutality had terrorized the eastern provinces for over a decade. Liu's psychological warfare was crude but effective. He displayed the heads of defeated enemies, tortured prisoners publicly, and spread tales of his invincibility through systematic terror campaigns. His reputation often won battles before. His armies arrived because opponents surrendered rather than face his legendary cruelty. However, I realized that Liu's psychological strength was also his strategic weakness. His entire power structure depended on maintaining an image of unstoppable ferocity. If that image could be shattered, his psychological hold over both enemies and followers would collapse simultaneously. I began a systematic campaign to undermine, lose reputation without engaging his forces directly. I spread carefully crafted stories about his failures, highlighted instances where his cruelty had backfired, and demonstrated through my own actions that his methods were neither necessary nor particularly effective. Most importantly, I positioned myself as the antithesis of everything he represented: strategic intelligence rather than brutal force, measured effectiveness rather than dramatic cruelty. When we finally met in battle, Liu's psychological armor had already been penetrated. His own troops had begun questioning whether their leader's methods were truly superior, while his enemies no longer feared him as a supernatural force. The actual military engagement became almost anticlimactic because the psychological battle had already been won. This experience taught me that every competitive situation involves both material and psychological dimensions, and victory in the psychological realm often determines the outcome more than advantages in resources, positioning, or capabilities. When you control how others think about the competition, you control the competition itself. I developed what I call the 4 levels of psychological strategy. Level 1 involves reputation management, controlling how others perceive your capabilities, intentions, and track record. This includes highlighting your strengths while concealing your weaknesses, positioning your successes strategically, and managing the narrative around your setbacks. Level 2 focuses on confidence disruption, introducing doubt and uncertainty into your opponent's decision-making processes. This might involve demonstrating capabilities they didn't know you possessed, revealing information that challenges their assumptions, or creating situations where their usual approaches prove ineffective. Level 3 employs strategic intimidation, not through threats or aggression, but through demonstration of superior preparation, resources, or strategic thinking. The goal is to convince opponents that challenging you would be costly and futile, leading them to seek alternative approaches that don't conflict with your objectives. Level 4 achieves psychological dominance, reaching a position where others naturally defer to your judgment and leadership, because they recognize your superior strategic capability. This is the highest form of competitive advantage because it makes direct competition unnecessary. In professional environments, these principles translate into sophisticated positioning and influence strategies. The executives who advance most rapidly are often those who understand the psychological dimensions of organizational competition, as well as the technical requirements of their roles. The key insight is that people make decisions based on emotions and justify them with logic. While they may claim to choose based on objective criteria like qualifications, performance, or strategic value, their actual choices are heavily influenced by psychological factors like confidence, likability, and perceived competence. This requires developing what I call strategic presence, the ability to influence how others feel about interacting with you and how they assess your capabilities. Strategic presence is not about manipulation or deception, but about authentic demonstration of competence, confidence, and value that creates positive psychological associations. The practice involves understanding the psychological drivers that influence decision-making in your specific environment. What creates confidence in your organizational culture? What generates respect and deference? What psychological needs do key stakeholders have that you could address through your professional interactions? It also requires recognizing and defending against psychological attacks from others. Competitors may attempt to undermine your confidence, question your competence, or create doubt about your reliability. The strategic master recognizes these tactics and has prepared responses that maintain psychological positioning while avoiding unnecessary conflict. Remember, the battle for minds precedes and determines the battle for positions when you win. The psychological competition, the material competition, often becomes unnecessary. When you lose psychologically, no amount of technical competence can compensate for the disadvantage you face in every subsequent interaction. The 14th strategic law governs the multiplication of power through strategic relationships. He who is skilled in warfare brings others into alliance with him, while he who lacks this skill stands alone against overwhelming opposition. Individual. Brilliance has limits, but collective capability guided by strategic intelligence can achieve objectives that remain impossible for any single actor. I mastered this principle during the campaign that established my reputation as the supreme strategist of my era. The kingdom of Chu had become dominant through conquest and intimidation, absorbing smaller states and threatening the independence of every remaining power. Traditional thinking suggested that each threatened kingdom should maximize its individual defensive preparations and hope to avoid Chu's attention. I recognized that this approach guaranteed eventual defeat through serial elimination. Chu's strategy was to prevent coalition formation by negotiating separate peace agreements with individual kingdoms while systematically destroying any state that showed signs of organizing collective resistance. Their power grew with each isolated victory, making the next target easier to defeat. Instead of accepting this dynamic, I began secretly building what would become known as the Great Alliance. The challenge was convincing 7 independent kingdoms, each with different interests and historical grievances against each other, to coordinate their efforts against a common threat. Some had territorial disputes with potential allies, others harbored economic rivalries or cultural prejudices that made cooperation seem impossible. My breakthrough came from recognizing that successful alliances require alignment of interests rather than similarity of values. I didn't try to make the kingdoms like each other. I focused on demonstrating that their individual survival depended on collective action. Each kingdom could pursue its particular objectives more effectively within a coordinated framework than through isolated action. The alliance proved devastating to Chu's strategy. Instead of facing 7 separate opponents sequentially, they suddenly confronted 7 coordinated opponents simultaneously. Their resource advantages disappeared when matched against combined opposition. Their diplomatic leverage evaporated when they could no longer negotiate separate deals. Within 2 years, Chu had agreed to a peace treaty that restored independence to previously conquered territories. This experience taught me that strategic alliances transform competitive dynamics entirely. When you can align others' interests with your own objectives, you gain access to capabilities, resources, and positioning that would be impossible to achieve independently. The key is understanding that alliance building is not about friendship or loyalty. It's about creating mutual advantage that makes cooperation more beneficial than competition. I developed what I call the 5 principles of strategic alliance. Formation. First, identify complementary strengths and shared vulnerabilities. The strongest alliances pair organizations or individuals whose capabilities compensate for each other's weaknesses while addressing common threats or pursuing compatible opportunities. Second, establish clear mutual benefits that exceed the costs of cooperation. Alliance partners must gain more through collaboration than they sacrifice through coordination requirements and shared decision-making. If the benefits aren't obvious and substantial, the alliance will collapse when pressures increase. Third, create formal agreements that specify responsibilities, resource contributions, and success criteria. Informal understandings work during easy times but fail when situations become complex or stressful. Clear agreements prevent misunderstandings and provide frameworks for resolving inevitable conflicts. Fourth, maintain separate identities while coordinating essential activities. Effective alliances preserve each partner's independence and unique capabilities while aligning efforts in specific areas. Total integration usually destroys the diversity that made the alliance valuable in the first place. Fifth, plan exit strategies and termination procedures. All alliances are temporary arrangements that serve specific purposes under particular circumstances. When those circumstances change, the alliance should evolve or dissolve gracefully rather than becoming a burden that constrains all partners. In professional environments, these principles apply to every form of strategic relationship, from formal partnerships and joint ventures to informal networks and collaborative projects. The professionals who achieve the most ambitious objectives are usually those who can mobilize support from diverse stakeholders rather than depending solely on individual capabilities. The key insight is that alliance building requires systematic relationship investment long before you need specific assistance. You cannot build strategic alliances during crisis situations. They must be developed during stable periods when you have time to understand others' interests and demonstrate your value as a collaborative partner. This requires developing what I call strategic relationship consciousness, continuous awareness of how your actions affect others' interests and how their actions could support or undermine your objectives. Most people focus primarily on their own immediate needs, while remaining oblivious to alliance opportunities that could multiply their strategic options. The practice involves identifying potential alliance partners based on complementary capabilities and compatible interests rather than personal comfort or similarity. It means investing time and resources in relationship building even when you don't have immediate needs. It requires understanding others' strategic challenges well enough to propose collaboration that serves their interests while advancing your own. Remember, individual excellence has natural limits, but strategic alliances can overcome those limits. By combining complementary strengths, the leader who can build and maintain effective coalitions gains access to collective capability that no individual can match through effort alone. The 15th and final strategic law synthesizes all previous principles into the ultimate competitive position. He who masters these strategic laws achieves what I call unbeatable status, not because he cannot be challenged, but because he cannot be defeated by anyone operating from conventional thinking and reactive positioning. I reached this understanding after decades of applying these principles across hundreds of competitive situations. The transformation was gradual but profound. I noticed that my opponents had begun changing their behavior before we even engaged. They would avoid direct confrontation, seek negotiated settlements, or simply choose not to compete for objectives they knew I was pursuing. My reputation for strategic mastery had created a psychological reality that influenced outcomes before any actual competition began. This was not the result of intimidation or fear, but of rational calculation by intelligence. Opponents who recognized that competing against superior strategic thinking was unlikely to produce favorable results. They had observed my systematic approach to competition and concluded that their resources would be better invested in opportunities where they faced less sophisticated opposition. Unbeatable status represents the culmination of strategic development, achos, position where your approach to competition is so systematically superior that rational opponents choose not to engage directly. This doesn't mean you become invulnerable or immune to setbacks, but rather that you operate from such fundamental advantages that defeating you requires extraordinary circumstances or serious errors on your part. The path to this status requires integrating all 14 previous strategic laws into a unified approach to competitive thinking. You must know yourself completely while understanding others better than they understand themselves. You must win without fighting whenever possible, while choosing your battles strategically when conflict becomes necessary. You must master timing and speed while maintaining flexibility and adaptation. You must control positioning and terrain while gathering superior intelligence about competitive dynamics. You must lead effectively under pressure while managing resources. Systematically, you must understand psychological dimensions while building strategic alliances. Most importantly, you must apply these principles consistently and systematically, rather than occasionally and randomly. The integration process involves developing what I call strategic instinct, the ability to recognize patterns and opportunities instantly without conscious analysis. This instinct emerges from repeated application of strategic principles until they become automatic responses rather than deliberate calculations. When you can assess situations, identify options, and choose approaches instantaneously, you gain timing advantages that compound all your other strategic benefits. However, unbeatable status creates its own challenges and responsibilities. Success can breed complacency, and dominance can create blind spots that undermine the very principles that created your advantages. The most dangerous opponent for a strategic master is often himself, when ego and overconfidence replace the systematic thinking and careful preparation that built his position. I learned to maintain what I call strategic humility, continuous recognition that circumstances change, new competitors emerge, and yesterday's advantages can become tomorrow's weaknesses. The moment you believe you have permanently solved the challenges of competition is the moment you begin losing the edge that made you unbeatable. This requires ongoing development rather than static maintenance of current capabilities. Markets evolve, organizations change, and competitive dynamics shift in response to technological, economic, and social developments. The strategic master adapts continuously while maintaining core principles that transcend specific circumstances. The practice involves regular strategic audits of your competitive position, systematic upgrading of capabilities and knowledge, and constant environmental scanning for emerging challenges and opportunities. You must remain a student of strategy even after becoming a master of implementation. In professional environments, unbeatable status manifests as consistent ability to achieve objectives regardless of obstacles, opposition, or adverse circumstances. Others begin seeking your guidance rather than competing with your position. Opportunities come to you rather than requiring active pursuit. Your strategic reputation creates advantages that multiply your actual capabilities. But remember that unbeatable status is not a destination. It's a dynamic condition that must be earned continuously through consistent application of strategic principles. The moment you stop thinking strategically is the moment you begin the decline from unbeatable back to ordinary. The ultimate insight is that becoming unbeatable is less about defeating others and more about mastering yourself. When you can think clearly under pressure, act decisively despite uncertainty, and maintain strategic perspective, regardless of emotional provocations, you develop the internal foundation that external strategic techniques require for maximum effectiveness. Your journey to unbeatable status begins with the decision to think strategically about every competitive situation you encounter. Each application of these principles builds the experience and instinct that will eventually transform you from someone who occasionally thinks strategically into someone who cannot think any other way. As I reflect on more than 2.5 millennia since I first developed these strategic principles, I am struck by their enduring relevance across every form of human competition and cooperation. The weapons have changed, the technology has evolved, and the scale of operations has expanded beyond anything I could have imagined. Yet the fundamental dynamics of strategic thinking remain constant. These laws have guided emperors and entrepreneurs, generals and executives, diplomats and politicians across every culture and historical period since my time. They have been applied in boardrooms and battlefields, in negotiations and markets, in relationships and career advancement. Their universality stems from their foundation in human nature and competitive dynamics that transcend specific circumstances. When I first codified these principles, I believed I was writing about military strategy for the warring states of ancient China. I never imagined that my insights would prove equally relevant to modern professionals navigating corporate hierarchies, entrepreneurs building businesses, or individuals pursuing personal advancement in competitive environments. Yet, this universality was perhaps inevitable, because these laws address the timeless challenges of how to achieve objectives in the face of opposition, how to coordinate collective effort toward common goals, and how to make decisions under uncertainty with incomplete information. These challenges are inherent to the human condition rather than specific to any particular era or activity. What I have shared with you represents the distillation of a lifetime spent studying the principles that separate winners from losers, leaders from followers, and strategic masters from tactical amateurs. These are not theoretical concepts or academic abstractions. They are practical tools tested through countless applications in situations where failure meant death and success meant survival, but knowledge without application remains worthless. These principles will transform your competitive effectiveness only if you commit to implementing them systematically rather than occasionally. Strategic thinking is not a skill you can master through reading or discussion. It must be developed through consistent practice in real situations with actual consequences. I challenge you to begin immediately. Look at your current professional situation through the lens of these strategic laws. Where are you operating from self-deception rather than honest self-assessment? Which competitors or obstacles do you understand poorly? What battles are you fighting that should be avoided entirely? How could you achieve your objectives through positioning rather than direct confrontation? Start with small applications where the stakes are manageable, then gradually increase the complexity and importance of situations where you apply strategic thinking. Each successful implementation will build your confidence and competence for more challenging applications. Remember that becoming a strategic master is a journey measured in years rather than months. I spent decades developing and refining these principles through trial and error, success and failure, victory and defeat. You have the advantage of learning from my experience rather than having to discover everything independently. But you still must develop the judgment and instinct that comes only through personal application. Most importantly, use these principles ethically and responsibly. Strategic thinking provides powerful capabilities that can be used for constructive or destructive purposes. Your responsibility is to apply this knowledge in ways that create value rather than causing harm, that build rather than destroy, that serve legitimate objectives rather than satisfying mere ego or greed. The world needs more strategic thinkers who can solve complex problems, build effective organizations, and lead others toward beneficial outcomes. The challenges facing humanity require the kind of systematic long-term thinking that these principles can provide. Your mastery of strategic thinking can contribute to solutions that benefit not just yourself, but the broader communities and organizations of which you are part. As I conclude this sharing of my life's work, I want you to understand that you now possess knowledge that most people will never encounter or understand. This knowledge carries the obligation to use it wisely and to share its benefits with others who can apply it constructively. The strategic laws I have taught you are my gift to the future, practical wisdom that transcends time and circumstance, to provide competitive advantage in any environment where intelligence, preparation, and systematic thinking can overcome obstacles and achieve worthy objectives. Your strategic mastery begins now, with your commitment to think differently about every competitive challenge you face. The world awaits what you will achieve when you apply these timeless principles to the unique opportunities of your time and place. Go forth and become unbeatable.